Well, hello class. Welcome back to week 2 of our Introduction to Logic course. Hey, one of the things I like to do when I start off my courses every week is to share what I call a God sighting. A God sighting is a moment in the week where I saw God show up in some interesting or significant way. And we'll look a little bit about how logic relates to theology as the course goes on. But let me tell you about my God sighting of the week. Our little church, Real Life Church of LA, was given a property this last year. Another church ended its time and they handed us the keys. They said, we'll give you our building if you promise to keep our preschool going. And so we've inherited a building and a preschool. And the preschool is functioning, and now we're getting ready to move our church worship services into this building. And in doing that, we decided that we would go and pray over the new property before we moved in. And so some friends and I agreed this last Saturday morning that we would meet together to pray for the church property. Well, funny thing happened. One of my friends and I showed up together to pray at the beginning of the meeting, and he said, I brought along something that for me is a symbol of what's happening here. And he pulled out of his pocket a little gold key. And he says, this key is a symbol to me of us getting the keys to this property, God giving us the keys to this property, and also us taking away the keys from dark forces in this world that would try to make the world a worse place. We're taking the keys away from them and making it a place that belongs to God. And so that's what he did. And that's what he said. Then he put the key back in his pocket. So we sat together and we prayed for about half an hour. And while we were praying together, another friend of ours walked in the back of the room and saw that we were praying. So he just stayed in the back of the room for a little while and prayed himself. And then he spoke up. And he didn't know anything about our conversation about the little key because he had walked in while we were still praying together. But he, in the back of the room, prayed. And he said out loud, he said, as I'm praying, I see a key. And I see dark forces showing up at this property to let themselves back in. Like when you get home at the end of the day and you reach for your key to let yourself in your house. But when they reach for their key and try to put it in the lock, it doesn't work anymore because the lock's been changed. They have to have a new key and they don't have it. And he didn't know anything about the fact that my friend had a key in his pocket that he had brought along as a symbol of what we were doing. And so for me, that's just a neat way that God confirms what we're doing. That God sees what we're doing and says, yes, I'm in this too. I see that it's true. I've given you this new property. I've given you the keys, not just the physical keys to the property, but I've given you these spiritual keys to bring in a new season in the life of this community. And those keys are yours. And that was just a neat way that God showed up in my life this last week. I love sharing stories like that, and I'll share stories like that with you throughout the course. If you see God show up in your life or in the lives of people around you, send me a note and let me know. I love hearing those stories, and I promise I'll leave your name out of it, but I'll share stories with the class that you send me. So if you hear a good story about God showing up, go ahead and send it along. I love hearing those. Those are always inspiring to me. So that is my God sighting of the week. Now for this week's class, we're going to do a couple of different things. We're going to work through some more problems in which we translate English sentences into symbolic logic. I want to work on that. And then I want to introduce to you truth tables. And if you've never worked with truth tables before, they're a lot of fun. You'll catch on. That's what we're going to do this week. But first, I want to give you a little introduction to where theology and logic intersect. Let's talk a little bit about the intersection between logic and theology. This is an intersection that some people think doesn't exist. They think that logic and philosophy move on completely separate paths and never intersect. That is obviously not true. A lot of that traces its way back to a Danish philosopher in the early 19th century named Søren Kierkegaard. And Kierkegaard found himself surrounded by European upper middle class pseudo-Christians who went to church but had no particularly passionate commitment to the faith they said they believed in. And Kierkegaard wanted to impress upon European society the idea that Christianity cannot be a social norm. It must be something that one passionately commits to. And so Kierkegaard refers to this passionate commitment as a leap of faith. The idea is that one can't simply contemplate Christianity forever. At some point, a person has to decide, I believe it or I don't. But I can't simply act as though I'm a Christian and do nothing about it. Kierkegaard would be happy with the analogy of a parabola, a curved line that gets closer and closer to its axis without ever reaching it. He says at some point, the Christian has to stop contemplating Christianity and actually make the leap off the parabola and onto the axis. At some point, a Christian must decide, this is what I believe in and this is what I'm going to live for. Now, the way that's gotten translated in the minds of a lot of modern Americans is that faith is a blind leap to believe without evidence or reason. That's not what the Bible says. And that's not what Christians have thought throughout history. It's actually a really bad way to think about anything. If faith is just a blind leap, then why leap to Christianity instead of Islam or just atheism? If faith is just a blind leap, you can leap to anything you want to. And there's no point to the decision that you're making. Christianity has never called for people to blindly believe in something for which there is no evidence. In fact, Jesus himself did something very different. Jesus says, if you don't believe in me, look at the miracles that I have been performing and believe because of those. Look with your eyes at the evidence. When one of Jesus' disciples, Thomas, can't believe that Jesus has risen from the dead and says, I won't believe unless I feel the holes in his hands and in his feet, Jesus appears to Thomas and says, look, touch my hands, see and believe. Jesus is happy to accommodate people's need for evidence. The rest of the New Testament does the same thing. The Apostle Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, there are 500 Christians who saw Jesus risen from the dead, many of whom are still alive. If you're making something up, or if you're hoping people will just believe in something blindly, you don't point towards evidence. But Paul is pointing towards evidence. There are 500 people who saw him risen from the dead. If you don't believe me, go ask them. The New Testament calls us to believe with evidence in the resurrection of Jesus. Kierkegaard was not actually trying to encourage a blind and irrational leap so much as trying to encourage people to make a decision that Christianity was an act that required your whole life and not just a socially agreeable performance. A modern philosopher and theologian who looked at Christianity from a slightly different angle and used logic quite a bit to try to convince people of the truth of the Christian faith is C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis lived about 100 years after Kierkegaard, in the middle of the 20th century. Lewis is one of the best known modern Christian writers and theologians, and his books have been translated into languages all over the world and sold tens of millions of copies. He's got about 40 books that he's written, I think. And in one of his books called Mere Christianity, he describes the kind of decisions that a person has to make about Jesus based on evidence. And here he uses a kind of abduction. Remember, abduction is an inference to the best possible conclusion. And he says, look at the story of Jesus. Jesus made magnanimous claims about himself. He made claims that he deserved to be worshipped, that he was in fact the Lord of all creation. Lewis says that leaves modern listeners, modern readers, with a decision to make. Either Jesus was a liar, a person who just made stories up, Or he was a lunatic, Lewis says, on the level of someone who considers himself to be a poached egg. Or he was who he said he was, the Lord of all creation. You must decide, Lewis says. You must make a rational decision based on abduction. What's the most logical explanation of who Jesus was? That he was a lying deceiver? Well, he went to his death miserably without taking back anything that he had said. If he was lying, the benefit of the lie ran out at the cross. If he was a lunatic, it's hard to explain how he so cleverly outwitted the Pharisees and religious leaders and managed to gain thousands of followers who recorded his teachings and who, to this day throughout history, billions of people have found him to be wise. If he's not a liar and he's not a lunatic, the conclusion that's left to us is that he was who he said he was, the Lord of all creation. What's interesting about Lewis's approach to this is that Lewis, who was a professor at Cambridge University, who had been a tutor at Oxford University, who was one of the only students to graduate from Oxford University with honors in 3 different areas of study. And Lewis brings logic to the table when investigating the claims of Jesus. He says that a person with an intelligent and logical mind ought to be able to investigate the story of who Jesus was and come to a reasonable conclusion. I would hold out to you that logic and faith do intersect, and that logic lends itself to the support of Christian theology. Let's review a little of what we learned in week 1 and put some of those skills to practice again. Remember, we talked about 5 different logical operators that we're going to be using through the course of our studies: negation, conjunction, disjunction, conditional, and biconditional. Those are different ways that we're going to connect different atoms, different symbols that we're going to use to represent English sentences and English arguments. Let's again take some English sentences from last week and see if we can't translate them into atomic symbols and operators. I just want you to get a good feel for how this works, because this week I'm going to give you some of these in your homework assignment if you're in my university course. Let's say N represents nothing is perfect, and B, I can be blamed for my mistakes, and E represents everything is perfect. Okay? How would we translate the sentence? If it's not true that everything is perfect, then I can't be blamed for my mistakes. If it's not true that everything is perfect, then I can't be blamed for my mistakes. If it's not the case that everything is perfect, you know you have a negation. And E represents everything is perfect. So we're going to start out with not E. And you can hear in the sentence that it's an if-then. If this is true, then that is true. So we know we have a conditional sentence. Not E, then, and the conclusion, the second part of the conditional, which is called the consequent, right? The antecedent and the consequent. The consequent is then I can't be blamed for my mistakes. And we know B is I can be blamed for my mistakes, and can't is a negation, so the consequent is not B. Not E, then not B is how we would translate that English sentence into symbolic logic. Here's another one. M is going to represent I make mistakes. Okay? I can be blamed for my mistakes only if I make mistakes and someone discovers them. I can be blamed for my mistakes only if I make mistakes and someone discovers them. We're going to make S represent someone discovers them. Okay? So I can be blamed for my mistakes is B. So we're going to start out with B. B is true if a combination of things is true, right? There are 2 things that need to be conjoined. So we know this is going to be a conjunction. if B, then I make mistakes and someone discovers them. M and S. The if then only means that the what sounds like the antecedent, if I can be blamed for my mistakes, only if actually reverts the sentence and makes what sounds like it's going to be the consequent become the antecedent. You'll see that again as we go along. Number 3, here we go. So if I either make a mistake or am blamed for my mistakes, then it is not true that everything is perfect. So you can hear in there it's a conditional statement. There's an if-then, right? So we know there's a conditional in the middle of it. If I either make a mistake or am blamed for my mistakes. You hear the or, so you know we have a disjunction. So what are the symbols that would go on either side of the or? If either I make mistakes or am blamed for my mistakes, that is M or B. Now we know it's a conditional sentence, so we put M or B in parentheses. That's our antecedent. M or B. If M or B, then it is not true that everything is perfect. So there you hear there's a negation, and you know that E means everything is perfect. So not E is the consequent. And that's how we turn that English sentence into symbolic logic. Are you seeing this? Let's do another one. And we're going to make M be a meteor caused the extinction of dinosaurs. And we're going to make H be a meteor could cause the extinction of the human species. And we're going to make D be the spread of disease caused the extinction of the dinosaurs. Okay? So, how would we represent if the extinction of the dinosaurs was not caused by a meteor, the spread of disease did it? If it was not caused by a meteor, then the spread of disease did it. Well, you know there's a negation in there because you hear not. And M stood for meteors destroying the dinosaurs. So not M. And you hear the if-then statement in there, so you know it's a conditional. So not M is the antecedent. And then you put the arrow because we're in a conditional statement. If not meteor, then disease. So the consequent is D. Not M. If not M, then D is how we write that as an English sentence. That's an easy one. That's a straightforward. Let's do another one. And in this one, we're going to say D represents dinosaurs can be cloned, and G represents scientists can fill in the missing gaps of dinosaur DNA. Okay? So D is dinosaur. This is a Jurassic Park illustration. D is dinosaurs can be cloned, and G is scientists can fill in the missing gaps in dinosaur DNA. How would we represent dinosaurs cannot be cloned unless scientists can fill in the missing gaps in dinosaur DNA, right? If they can't do something, then they can't do something else. They can only do something if something else is possible. So another way of saying this is if they can't fill in the gaps in dinosaur DNA, then they cannot be cloned. So you hear two negations and a conditional sentence. So the way we would represent this is if not G, then not D. If they can't fill in the gaps, then they can't clone dinosaurs. And let's hope they don't. Now let me introduce you to a new concept called truth tables. A truth table is a way that we're going to break down an argument into its various parts to find out whether an argument is true in a very long, arduous kind of way. Truth tables are something that you need to understand as kind of the background of symbolic logic, though we're going to do those at the beginning of the course, and then later on we won't do them as much. Nonetheless, there's something that you need to get down as we start. Here's how a truth table works. In the left columns of a truth table, you place all the atoms of the argument. So for instance, let's start with the negation. Negation would be not P. So in the left column, we put just the letter P, because that is the only atom in this argument. There are no other letters. There's no other representations. And we list underneath the atom all the different truth values it can have. And each atom can only have two truth values. It is either true or false. And so underneath the P, we write true and false. Those are the only two options we have. And then in the next column, we write the argument itself, which is not P, the negation. And we write down what P becomes when it is negated. So if P is true, then not P is false. And if P is false, then not P is true. And that is probably the simplest truth table we're going to build. A truth table breaks down all the individual arguments, all the individual pieces of an argument. It looks at all the possible truth values of each one, and then lays out how they play out when applied in the argument. Now let's look at the truth table for a conjunction. Let's take the conjunction P and Q. So in the left-hand columns, first we write all the individual atoms of the argument. In this case, there are two, P and Q. And underneath P and Q, we write down all the possible options. You'll notice in this truth table there are more than when we only had one truth table. Only one atom. Because with two of them, you have four different options. P can either be true or false, and Q can either be true or false. But there are four different combinations you can have between them. P can be true, and Q can be true. P can be true, and Q can be false. P can be false, and Q can be true, or both of them can be false. And so the way we write that down is as you're listing underneath the atoms, under the P, you write true, true, false, false, and under the Q, you write true, false, true, false. And that's how you do the left-hand side of the column. Then we write the argument itself, P and Q. Well, this is how the conjunction works. If both elements of a conjunction are true, then the conjunction is true. But in any other case, the conjunction is false. Because for a conjunction to be true, both elements have to be true. P and Q means P is true and Q is true. So if, as you see in the second line, P is true and Q is false, then the conjunction is false. Same thing for line 3. And obviously in line 4, if both of them are false, the conjunction of them is definitely false. And that is how you build a truth table for the conjunction. Let's build the truth table for the disjunction, P or Q. Again, in the left-hand columns, we list the atoms P and Q. And we give them the four different combinations of truth values they can have. P can be true or false, and Q can be true or false. So we look at the four combinations that we listed in the last truth table: true, true, false, false, true, and false, false. Then we look at the disjunction, P or Q. Well, now remember in the disjunction, if either one of the elements is true, then the disjunction is true. So what we're saying is, for instance, either it's raining outside or I am not carrying an umbrella. Either it's raining outside or I'm not carrying an umbrella. Well, if it's true that it's raining outside, then the disjunction is going to be true. And if it's true that I'm not carrying an umbrella, then the disjunction is going to be true. It only takes one element of a disjunction for it to be true. So in the disjunction, we're going to see that if both are true, the disjunction is true. Or if one or the other is true, the disjunction is true. Only if both of them are false does the disjunction turn out to be false. And so this is what the truth table of a disjunction looks like. Now we'll do the truth table of the conditional. We set up the truth table the same way we've set up the truth table so far. There's still only two atoms, And so the left columns look the same. And then we write if P then Q. And in this case, there's only one instance in which a conditional can be false. And that's the case where the antecedent is true and the consequent is false. Because what the conditional says is, if it's raining outside, then I'll carry an umbrella. And in the instance where it's raining outside and I don't carry an umbrella, we have violated the conditional. We have made the conditional false. But in all other instances, the conditional is true. That can seem a little bit confusing in the case of P being false and Q being true. But what we're evaluating here is whether or not the conditions of the conditional have been met. And there's only one case in which they have not, and that is where the conditional sentence itself is violated, where the antecedent is true and the consequent is false. A biconditional is a little bit different. Because the biconditional goes both ways, a biconditional is true when both atoms are true or when both atoms are false. If one is true, then the other is true. Or if one is false, then the other is false. That's what a biconditional says. And so this is what the truth table of a biconditional looks like. That now gives us the 5 truth tables for the 5 operators that we have looked at. And I want to show you a video of another teacher talking about this, because sometimes hearing the same teaching from the mouth of someone else helps make it more clear.
Propositional logic series. So the first question you might have is, why bother studying this? Why bother studying all these P's and Q's? And here's some reasons. First, it'll help you better understand how computers work at a deep level. It'll lay the foundations for that. It'll help you better understand and do math. It'll create more logical circuitry in your brain, so to speak, neural networks. It'll help you learn habits of thinking that are just more logical and they become ingrained. It'll help you symbolize arguments and thereby quickly and more accurately identify their validity or invalidity. So a lot of arguments, you don't even have to think about the content. You can just put them in symbols in your mind and quickly see they're valid or invalid. And finally, I think it's fun and challenging. Okay, so hopefully that'll keep you motivated through all of this. The categorical versus modern. So we're leaving the categorical Aristotelian traditional logic and moving to the modern, and we're going to start with this propositional logic. The difference is that categorical logic dealt with actual words and categories. Like if I wanted to say all dinosaurs are funny creatures, I would symbolize that with Aristotle's method as all SRP. But now with modern symbolic logic, the letters will represent entire statements. So all dinosaurs are funny would just be represented as D. It's a whole proposition that's making a truth claim. That's either true or false, right? So we're dealing with propositions, not classes, and we can do much more with modern logic. So with that in mind, let's look at an example here. S, let's say that represents the proposition that I'm wearing a blue shirt. So if S is true, then it's true that I'm wearing a blue shirt. And if S is false, then it's false that I'm wearing a blue shirt, right? Now, if not S is true, then it's true that it is not the case that I'm wearing a blue shirt, right? And you want to, instead of just saying I'm not wearing a blue shirt, it's helpful in logic to say it's not the case that I'm wearing a blue shirt for reasons we'll see later. Okay, so also when you write statements, you don't want to have S represent I'm not wearing a blue shirt. Rather, you want to make a positive assertion and then put not S if you're not wearing a blue shirt. We'll see why later. Don't worry about it right now. Okay. So the letters represent true or false statements, but there are some sentences out there that don't make truth claims, like who are you? Or close that door. And we won't be able to translate those sentences into our modern logic. So keep that in mind. It doesn't translate everything well. Here's a compound statement because it's making two different truth claims. So I'm wearing a blue shirt and I'm wearing clogging shoes, right? Or I'm wearing a blue shirt and clogging shoes. That would be represented as S and P or B and C. It doesn't matter what letters you use, okay? But that's a compound statement. So here's some practice. See if you can just put these into symbolic form using some letter. So for example, for number 1, you might write J or just S, you know. For number 2, you might write S and P, right? Number 3 might be I'm either clogging or singing, might be C or S. Okay, I'm going to show you the answer slide in just a minute. And there you go. Notice number 4, I put dogs like cats, and then I put a not in front of that. It's not the case that dogs like cats. Right? Okay. Now, instead of using these little words here like and or and not, we want to symbolize those too. We want to put everything into symbols. Okay, so we introduce these 5 operators. You can see the first operator here, right here, is called the tilde. It's a nice name, and it represents negation. So instead of saying not or it's not the case that, I'm going to use a little tilde. And then the dot will represent and also, and it's what we call a conjunction. It conjoins two propositions. The V will represent the wedge. It's a disjunction. Usually or captures that. By the way, the and is sometimes represented with an upside down V in some books. Okay. The horseshoe represents if-then sentences, and that represents implication. We'll go over that later. And in some books it'll be an arrow pointing to as a right instead of a horseshoe, but we'll use the horseshoe. And then the last one is a triple bar, which represents equivalence, and that's if and only if statements. And in some books that's represented with arrows going both ways. Okay, so here's those same sentences again, statements I should say, and they're represented now with letters and operators. So look at number 2, John Denver is a great singer and pilot, J.P. Right? Number 3, I'm either clogging or singing, C. Whoop, I capitalized the V. I meant to lowercase, but C wedge S. Right? Dogs don't like cats, not D, and so on. Okay. All right. So let's talk about each one of these in a little more detail and do some the truth tables for them. Okay. And if you look at the tilde, which represents negation, this is very. Let me make sure I'm going in the right. Yes, okay. So the tilde represents negation. The tilde is the only operator that can occur right after another operator. So if I say I'm eating green beans or I'm not healthy, that would be G, I'm eating green beans, right? G, wedge, not H. H represents I'm healthy, not H, I'm not healthy. Okay, so it can occur right after the wedge operator. It's kind of neat. Anyway, P, let's say P represents I'm wearing a blue shirt. That's either true or false. A statement can be true or false. Based on that, we can figure out it's not the case that P. So if it's true that I'm wearing a blue shirt, then it's not the case that P. It's not the case I'm wearing a blue shirt. It must be false. If it's false that I'm wearing a blue shirt, then it's not the case that I'm wearing a blue shirt. It must be true. Okay, so that's what this truth table means. Okay. You just reverse the values. So see if you can translate these real quick. Monkeys don't fly, and it's not the case that if I turn in my homework I'll ace this course, and so on. And here's the answers. Not M. Notice number 2, it's not the case that the whole statement, if H then A, because they're not saying if I don't turn in my homework I'll ace this course. That would be not H then A with no parentheses. Rather they're saying it's not the case that if I turn in my homework, I'll ace this course. Look at the last one, number 3. Neither Clemson nor Virginia will win the championship. So it's not the case that Clemson will win or Virginia will win. Okay. Now, for number 3, you might have represented it like this down here in the bottom. It's not the case that Clemson will win, and it's not the case that Virginia will win. And these two are equivalent, same thing. So you would be correct if you did it that way. And later we'll use this logical equivalence in proofs and so on. All right. Okay, the main operator is very important. We want to understand this concept because we'll later use the main operator to determine whether the entire statement is true or false. Okay, it's the one operator that covers the entire statement. So for example, my socks are not a main operator, metaphorically, because they only cover my feet. My shirt only covers my waist and chest and arms, so it's not a main operator. But if I got into a let's say I'm inside a tent. The tent would be a main operator because it covers all of me. Okay, so let's look at the main operators here. This will help later. If I say S and P, the main operator is the only operator and, right? If I say, let's say number 6, not A or B, the main operator is or because it applies to the whole sentence, or most of it, A or B. The tilde is not the main operator because it only applies to A, not to B. Look at number 2. If S and P, then Q or R. The little and dot here only applies to S and P, not to Q and R. Therefore, it's not the main operator. The little wedge, Q or R, only applies between Q and R, only applies to Q and R, not to S and P. So it's not the main operator. Here is the main operator, the little horseshoe. because it connects the whole. So once I know the value of the horseshoe, whether true or false, then I know the value of this whole statement. Once I know the value of this and number 1, this dot, I know the value of this whole statement. Okay, so on this slide I'll show you the answers. And there they are. Here's the main operators. And you can kind of tell the main operator will always be outside of the parentheses, if you have parentheses, more than one parentheses. And this one is complex, right? All these little brackets and stuff. But if you think it through, I think you'll see that the tilde is what applies to the whole statement. None of these apply to the whole statement. The and, because the tilde here only applies to P or Q, not to M or B. So the and is the main operator. Okay. The next one is the conjunction, and this is the conjunction is P and Q. So I'm wearing a blue shirt and I'm clogging. P represents blue shirt, Q is I'm clogging. So if both are true, I'm wearing a blue shirt, I'm clogging, then the conjunctive sentence, the main operator of P and Q, is true. But if any one of those is false, either P or Q is false, then it's false. So if I'm not wearing if I'm not clogging, but I'm wearing a blue shirt, then this P and Q is false, right? So they both have to be true in order for the dot to be true. And this is something you got to memorize. You'll be using it over and over again, and it's helpful to talk through it, like with my example with blue shirts and clogging. Okay, let's do the wedge now. The wedge over here, the main operator for P or Q, this is true unless both disjuncts are false, and the disjunct, one disjunct is P and one is Q. Okay, now before I even get started, I'm going to explain truth tables in the next lesson, but notice when you have 2 letters, you're going to have 4 rows, because you're giving all possible combinations. It's like flipping 2 coins twice, right? You're going to have 4 possible combinations. Heads, 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 tails, tails, heads, and tails, tails. So that's what we're capturing here, all possible combinations. We'll get to that later. But P, I'm wearing a blue shirt, or I'm clogging. If they're both true, it's true. It's what we call an inclusive or. And then as long as one is true, either I'm wearing a blue shirt or I'm clogging, then this or, the wedge, is true. But if I'm not wearing a blue shirt and I'm not clogging, then the wedge, of course, combining them is false. Okay. Now, sometimes when you have an or sentence in English, like I'm in Austin or Orlando, Florida, I'm in Austin, Texas, or Orlando, Florida, you can't represent that with A or O, because you can't be in both, right? So this first line wouldn't apply. I can't be in both right now. So we'll learn later that you can still represent that sentence by saying A or O, but it's not the case that A and O, and we'll get to that later. Okay. The next one is a conditional. All right. So this is called material implication. And when you see if-then sentences, they'll probably be expressed as if P, then Q. And the best way to remember this is that it's always true unless you have a true antecedent and a false consequent. And I did a little video on conditionals that you can check out later. But if it's raining, then the roads are wet. Okay, so P represents raining, Q, the roads are wet. Both are true, it's true. But if it's raining and the roads aren't wet, then my statement must be false. Now, if it's not raining and the roads are wet, for all I know, that's true, right? If the antecedent is false, then the conditional is going to be true. It's kind of counterintuitive. So Hurley suggests you use the example of if I make an A on the final, then I'll ace the course. Okay. Now, if it's false that you make an A in the final, but still true that you ace the course, well, the teacher didn't lie to you, so it could very well be true. Or if it's false that you made an A in the final and false that you made an A in the course, then again, the teacher didn't lie to you, so if P, then Q is true. Now, again, there's some English statements that involve causation with if, then P, then Q that we just need to capture in a different way. So you have to be careful, but for now, just memorize the truth table, and we'll get to those more complicated ones later. Finally, there's the biconditional, and this is P, and then you see 3 lines in Q. Okay, so this is P if and only if Q. And when I see this symbol, I think of if P horseshoe Q and if Q horseshoe P. That's basically what it means. But the bottom line is that this is true whenever P and Q have the same truth value. So I'll jump over a cliff if and only if you do, or off a cliff, right? So if you jump over, then I will, right? And vice versa. So now if you don't jump over, then I won't. So it's true if they're both false, P or Q are both false, and it's true if P and Q are both true. But if you jump over and I don't, then it's false. Or if I jump over and you don't, then it's false. So that's a pretty easy one to remember, right? Okay. So in the next video, I'll go over well-formed formulas and give some more practice on determining the truth of compound statements. Thanks.
So now I want to show you how to make a truth table for a couple of different arguments, and they're going to be arguments built on the atoms P and Q. Let's start with the following expression. We'll use not P and Q. The upward pointing arrow usually means and. It's just like the dot. It's just a different symbol that sometimes logicians use to represent the conjunction. And so this would be, for instance, the argument, it's not raining outside and I am staying inside. We're going to build a truth table using P and Q in the left-hand column, as we always do. And we're going to start with both of them being false, one being false, one being true, and then both of them being true. Every truth table builds from all the premises being false at the beginning of the truth table, and they work down towards all of them being true. That's just a good pattern to remember when you are building your own truth tables. They begin all being false, and they end all being true. So it's not raining outside, and I'm staying inside. Or it's not raining outside, and I'm not staying inside. Whatever you want, however you want to do it. Not P and Q. So we built the most common truth table that we use for arguments with two atoms in them. And now we have to sort of look at the argument and see what other elements the truth table needs. We have a negation and we have a conjunction, right? We have a not P, and so we're going to have to build a column around the idea of not P. And what we do is, as you know, we take the P and we negate each of its truth values. We did this when we showed the truth table for the negation. So you have, for instance, when P is false, what is not P? It's true. And so that happens a couple of different times in the truth table for the negation, right? And in each case that P is false, not P is then true. And conversely, every time that P is true, we then note that not P is false. So now we've added a column that gives us the truth values for the negation of P. Now we want to do not P and Q. And so what we're going to do is we're going to do the conjunction of the second column and the third column. And this is going to follow the simple pattern of a truth table of a conjunction. Remember, we're not trying to analyze the whole statement at once. We're trying to get to the whole statement by building individual columns for specific parts of the argument, like not P, and also Q, so that in the final column we can summarize our argument and look at the argument based on what's the main operator. The main operator is, in this case, the conjunction, not the negation. So we're going to look at the second column and the third column and figure out what goes in the third column based on the two of those. If Q is false and not P is true, then the conjunction is false. If both of them are true or both of them are false, then we know they end up being true and false. And in the final column, it's false as well, because in a conjunction, it requires that both elements of the conjunction be true. So there's only one row in which they're all true. Let's look at the argument P or not Q and not P or Q. And we can come out with a long English sentence describing that, but we don't actually have to. Let's just break down the argument into its various elements. Again, P and Q make up the left-hand columns. Those are the basic atoms. We start with both of them being false. We lead to both of them being true. We always try to structure our truth tables that way. And that's going to be true when there are more than 2 atoms. We'll add more letters as we go, but these are pretty simple arguments. Let's start with not P, because we've got a negation in there. We've done that column before. We had that one in the previous example up above. And we know that we just take the values in the left-hand column, the values of P, and we put the opposite in the not P column. When we negate P, we end up with the opposite of P. So when P is false, not P is true. P is true, not P is false. Okay, so now we've got one column. We might as well go to the other negation and do not Q. Standardly in a truth table, you go to the next simplest operator and make those your following columns after the basic atoms. This works exactly like the first column. Straight forwardly, you negate the truth values of Q, and that gives you our 4th column of the truth table. So where do we go from here? Where would you go? What would you do next? There are a couple options, but let's start from left to right and do what is contained in the first parentheses, P or not Q. And now we're going to analyze the 2 columns that are related, the column of P and the column of not Q. And we're going to create a disjunctive truth table of those 2 columns. So in a disjunctive truth table, which columns are true and which columns are false? Do you remember this? In a disjunction, only one element has to be true. But if they're both false, the disjunction is false. If they're both true, the disjunction is true. If only one is true, just like it was in the first column, the disjunction is still true. All right, so now we've broken down about half of our argument. We're getting closer now. Let's break down the other half, and it's going to work very similarly to what we just did. Not P or Q is another disjunction. We're just going to use 2 different columns. We're going to use the not P column and the Q column. And it's going to flow exactly like the previous column. It's a disjunction. So only in the case where both columns are true will it be true. When they're both false, it will be false. That's pretty easy to do. And so now we've broken down the 2 halves of our equation, leaving us with a main operator, which is the conjunction, which again I've drawn with an upwards arrow here. Let's look at the big argument now. We're just simply making a conjunction of these 2 columns. That's easy. The conjunction truth table shows that both of them have to be true for the sentence to be true, for the argument to be true, and that happens twice in this argument. And so now we've shown how to draw a fairly complex truth table based on what we've worked on so far. I hope that is helpful. Let's go back to C.S. Lewis's argument with which we began our lecture today. Remember, Lewis said that Jesus was either the Lord of all creation, he was a liar, or he was a lunatic. You'll hear Christians refer to this as the Lord, liar, lunatic argument. And let's form this as an argument in symbolic logic and see what we might do with it. The basic atoms of the argument are Jesus is Lord, which we can represent with the letter G for God. Jesus is a liar, which we can represent with the letter L for a liar. Or Jesus is a lunatic, which we'll represent with the letter C for crazy. And Lewis's first premise is Jesus is Lord or liar or lunatic. So G or L or C is our first premise. Lewis's second premise is that he can't be a lunatic. He can't be crazy. He was wise. He gained a following. He was clever in his argumentation. He shows no signs of mental illness. You've met people in your life who are mentally ill, and they don't function and process the way Jesus did. So the second premise is not C. The third premise, the next argument that Lewis makes, is that Jesus wasn't a liar. The value of lying ran out at the cross. There was no way that Jesus would have thought he was going to benefit from making up lies about himself and then dying to defend them. So, premise number 3, he was not a liar. So, how do disjunctions work? Well, one of the elements of a disjunction has to be true. They don't all have to be true, only one has to be true. And Lewis says, well, he's not a lunatic and he's not a liar, so what does that leave us? The conclusion is G, that Jesus is God. Lewis uses this argument actually to make a fairly thoughtful point. He's arguing against what a lot of people say about Jesus in the modern world, which is that Jesus was a good moral teacher, like Socrates or Buddha. That Jesus had wise and clever or loving things to say, and that was about it. And then later on, people added on stories about him, and that's where we got all the supernatural stuff. Lewis says that's an absolutely nonsensical argument. A moral person could not make the claims about himself that he did because the claims that he made about himself would be arrogant. He allowed himself to be worshipped. He said that he was one with the Father, and that if anybody wanted to know what God was about, they just had to look at Jesus. Look at the Gospel of John chapter 10. He makes it very clear. Jesus called far too much attention to himself to be simply a good, humble, moral teacher. And so that is not one of the options that Jesus left us with. He could be crazy, he could be a liar, he could be who he said he is, but he didn't leave us the option of calling him a good moral teacher. And Lewis says he did not intend to. But this will give you an idea of how symbolic logic can be used to analyze the way people are arguing in public debate. And I find this particularly entertaining to look at in the form of symbolic logic and truth tables right around the time of presidential debates. Because I've never seen as many logical fallacies and bad arguments as I have when two presidential candidates get together and debate. They almost never use sound logical reasoning. They generally call names and insult one another or avoid the issue. But logical argumentation rarely enters into their conversations. I challenge you in the next presidential election to take what we've learned in symbolic logic and see if you can use it to translate the arguments of a presidential candidate into argumentation and see if you can get anything solid or reliable out of it. But this is why we use symbolic logic. It allows us to look at arguments in a calm and reasonable way, devoid of the emotion that would be tied to the arguments written out in English statements. Let's build a truth table based on a slightly more complicated problem using 3 atoms instead of 2. We'll make a truth table for the following expressions. We'll start with not P or R, or P and not R or Q. It's just a longer, more complicated version of what we've already been doing, but if you've gotten through what we've been doing so far, you'll do just fine on this. So when you look at things like this, I know at first it's very intimidating, but don't worry about it. Just look at it and think we're going to do the left-hand columns exactly like we've done it with the other truth tables, except we're going to work our way towards a longer conclusion. So what would you do first? P, Q, and R are going to be our 3 atoms, and we're just going to have a longer list of true values underneath them because we're going to have every possible combination of true and false, working from all of them being false to all of them being true. And we can just list these out. One way to do this, that some people like to do it, is to just go down the left column first and write false, 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 true, 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 true. But we're always trying to work from all falses to all trues, so either way you do it is fine. You'll notice the second column is then false, false, true, true, false, false, true, true, and the last column is false, true, false, true, false, true, false, true. Right? So that's an easy way to remember that. But that gives us every possible combination of the 3 atoms as we work towards this long argument. Think about what we did last time, where we started. We start with the easiest ones, which is the negations. We have a not P. And not P is as easy as can be to do, but we have a longer list of truth values here, so we simply negate all 8 of them, just like we did in the first problems. And that gives us the not P column. We can look now at not P or R, the first parenthetical section of the argument at the beginning. You don't have to do that next. You could do not R next if you wanted to, but it might be easiest just to write this out by starting with not P or R. And we have a disjunction. So what happens when one is false and the other is true? Well, it's true. And when they're both true, it's true. We've already done one where one of them is true, so we know that's true. The one we're looking for is where they're both false. That's the one that's going to leave us with a value that is false. So we can go ahead and fill them all in, and we see that 2 of them are false. That gives us the first parenthetical section. Now we can do the negation of the R, also very easy. We just fill in the opposite of the R column. And what do you think we're going to do after that? We take this one very easily, negate all the truth values in the R column, and do that one very easily. We've already kind of tipped our hat to where we're going next. We're going to take the parenthetical comment here and do exactly what we did on the previous parenthetical comment, combining the 2 columns, the Q and the not R column. Very, very easy to do. It's exactly what you've done before. And what do we do in a disjunction? We know that we're going to fill in false for everyone where both of them are false, but on all the other ones where they're both true or one of them is true, the values are going to be true. So again, we end up with 2 false values where both of them are false. Okay, well that gives us the second parenthetical comment. Now we're going to build towards a larger bracketed part of the argument, and again, it's very similar to what we've done. We're going to take the 2 relevant columns and treat them as a conjunction. We have P and the parenthetical not R or Q. And we're just going to follow the truth table of a conjunction, which is very easy to do. And as you recall, in the truth table for a conjunction, both of them have to be true. So where both of them are true, we know the value is going to be true. That happens 3 times here, right? True, true, and true, and true. But in any other instance where at least one of them or both of them are false, we know how that truth table is going to go. All right, so now we've done the bracketed section of the argument, plus we've already done the first parenthetical section. So now we're down to the main operator, which is the disjunction in the middle. That's the main operator. So now we're going to create our final argument for the section here. We're going to just label it A so it'll fit, so we don't have to copy the whole thing out again, right? We're going to just call the whole argument A for argument. In your homework, you might as well write the whole thing out. Okay, let's take the parenthetical section at the left and the bracketed section at the right and combine them using what we know of disjunctions. In disjunctions, if at least one of them is true, then the argument is true, and that will play out in all of these instances. True, true, true. Look at that. The argument is always true. There's never an instance where it isn't. There you go. I know some of you at the university are interested in going into Christian ministry as a profession, and I want to talk a little bit about how logic and Christian ministry intersect. I know you might think they don't, just like logic and theology, but in fact they do. And I want to cite for you an example of a pastoral counseling session I had probably 15 years ago with somebody I was working with who was struggling with a family issue. And most of counseling is just listening. And a little bit of counseling is asking questions. And a tiny little bit of counseling is making suggestions. But it's mostly just listening. But this is one of those instances where I had a question to ask, which was a logical question. And the logical question actually helped the person process her experience. She was a professional working in a business. But she had a hard relationship with her parents. And her parents, when they did not get what they wanted from her, would threaten to manipulate her. They would try to get her to do what they wanted by telling her that if she didn't, they would make bad things happen in her life. and this is a terrible thing for parents to do, but some parents do this. And so she was a business professional with lots of clients, and her business was fairly successful. And her parents, I forget what they wanted her to do now, but let's say they wanted her to move back home, let's say. And so what they did is they told her, well, if you don't move back home like we want you to, we're going to contact all of your clients from your business and tell them that you're a terrible person, and that will undermine your business. This is actually parents talking to their child and saying this. And so she was distraught. And she came and sat and talked with me and said, I don't know what to do. If my parents contact all of my clients, they can undermine my business, and then I will have to move back home because I won't have a business anymore. And first I did listen, because a lot of pastoral counseling is letting people process, letting people say what they need to say and get it off their chest and have someone lovingly respond and care about what they have to say. And so a lot of counseling is just that. And so I let her process. I asked her questions about her parents, about her relationship with her parents, how it had been, how some of the history of the relationship had been. But then after a while I said, now I do have one question about their threat in particular. I said, how many of your clients do your parents know personally? And she said, well, they don't know any of them personally. They've never met any of my clients. And I said, okay, how many of your clients then do, of your clients, how many of them do your parents possess the contact information for them? How many means of contacting your clients do your parents actually have? How many of them could they call? How many phone numbers or addresses do your parents have? And she thought about it for a second, and she said, well, my parents don't have any of that information. I don't give that out. And I said, okay, so your parents are saying they're going to contact all of your clients and tell them you're a terrible person, but they don't know any of your clients, and they have no means of contacting any of your clients. And you could kind of see the light bulb go on. And she said, yeah, that's right. And I said, so there's absolutely no way they could do this. This situation will never play out in real life. And it just kind of dawned on her. She goes, oh, no, you're right. That could never happen. And so most of counseling is not trying to reason people out of their problems. That's not what good counselors do. But this was just a logical question based on the context of her situation that she was describing. And I just asked a logical question. How could this play out? What we're talking about in symbolic logic is either they can contact all your clients and destroy them, or they can't contact any of your clients and can't destroy your business. What's the truth table you would build under this? Well, the truth is they can't contact any of the clients, so the disjunction leaves you with the option that the only true option is they can't do it. And that was a place where logic actually helped in pastoral counseling. What's important spiritually behind that is that sometimes what lies behind some of our big dysfunctions is a broken worldview. We see the world wrongly, either because we're confused or we're hurt or people have lied to us, but we see the world wrongly. If we believe that there's no God out there who cares for us, we don't believe there's a God at all, that's a wrong worldview. And that wrong worldview will leave us confused. And learning how to approach the world reasonably and develop a reasonable and correct worldview is an important part of maturation and healing. And so logic does actually play an important role in Christian counseling and Christian ministry generally. So I hope that's helpful for you. I'm going to give you some homework assignments that involve truth tables and translating English sentences into symbolic logic. If you have questions about it, don't hesitate to reach out and send me a message. I am glad to help. God bless you. I'll see you next week.